in the vast expanse of the galaxy, where ancient empires span thousands of star systems and alien royalty command fleets that could obliterate entire worlds. One moment of choice would rewrite the destiny of two civilizations forever. Princess of the Empire had witnessed the fall of countless species. Her people, were apex predators of the cosmos, 7 feet tall, with crystalline skin that could deflect energy weapons and minds capable of processing battle strategies across multiple dimensions simultaneously. For 3, they had conquered, absorbed, or eliminated every species that dared challenge their dominion. But then came the humans. These strange, soft-skinned creatures from a backwater world called Earth had done something no other species had managed in history. They had fought the Empire to a standstill, not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through sheer, incomprehensible stubbornness. Where other species would surrender when facing impossible odds, humans would charge forward. Where logic dictated retreat, humans would find a way to turn certain defeat into unlikely victory. Now, as part of an ancient treaty ritual that would determine the fate of both civilizations, Princess stood before a gathering of humanity's finest warriors. The tradition was simple. She would choose one champion to represent humanity in a series of trials that would test not just combat prowess, but wisdom, courage, and the very essence of what it meant to be human. The assembled warriors were impressive, veterans of interstellar campaigns, decorated heroes who had single-handedly turned the tide of battles, strategic geniuses who had outwitted commanders. Any one of them would have been a logical choice. Instead, her 6 eyes fixed on the youngest person in the room. 18-year-old stood at the back, barely old enough to legally enlist, with no decorations on his simple uniform and no great victories to his name. He was just a maintenance technician from Earth's orbital defense stations, present only because of a clerical error that had mistakenly included him in the ceremony. When the princess pointed her elongated finger at him, speaking his name in perfect English despite it being the first human word she had ever uttered, the room fell into stunned silence. What she saw in that moment, what her advanced perception detected in the quantum patterns surrounding this unremarkable young human, would either save both their species or doom them to a war that would consume the entire galaxy. The die was cast, destiny was sealed, and who had never fired a weapon in anger or commanded anything more complex than a maintenance droid, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest warriors are forged not in the heat of battle, but in the crucible of impossible choice. This is their story. Had always believed that his biggest problem in life was trying to explain to his parents why he dropped out of engineering school to become a maintenance technician on orbital station Gamma 7. That morning, as he floated through the zero-gravity corridors checking atmospheric processors and life support systems, he couldn't have imagined that by evening he'd be standing in the most important room in human space, about to change the course of galactic history. The day had started normally enough, completed his routine inspections, filed his reports, and was looking forward to his weekly video call home to Earth. His parents would ask the same questions they always did. When was he coming back to finish his degree? Why was he wasting his talents on grunt work, and didn't he want something more meaningful from his life? The irony wasn't lost on him now. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came when Admiral Torres herself appeared on the station's main communication screen. Had never seen the Supreme Commander of Earth Defense Forces address individual stations directly, and the tension in her weathered face suggested this wasn't a routine announcement. "All personnel, this is Admiral Torres," she began, her voice carrying the weight of command across multiple star systems. "As of 1400 hours today, the Empire has invoked the Accords of. For those unfamiliar with this ancient protocol, it represents our best hope for lasting peace with the Empire." Floated near a maintenance console, magnetic boots disengaged, listening with growing unease. The Accords of weren't exactly common knowledge, but anyone who'd lived through the border wars understood their significance. They were an ancient tradition, a way of resolving conflicts through ritualized trials rather than devastating warfare. "Princess, heir to the throne, will arrive at Earth Central Command in 6 hours," Admiral Torres continued. "She will select a human champion to undergo the 7 trials of worthiness. The outcome of these trials will determine whether our species coexist peacefully or return to open conflict." The transmission ended with coordinates and a list of personnel to report for the selection ceremony. Scanned the names, expecting to see the usual suspects. Colonel Sarah Martinez, who'd held off an entire battle group at the Nebula. Commander Jackson Pike, the tactical genius who developed the strategies that had kept Earth's outer colonies safe. Major, whose single-ship assault on a dreadnought had become the stuff of legend. His own name appeared at the bottom of the list, and stared at it for several long seconds, certain there'd been a mistake. "Computer, verify personnel roster for Earth Central Command ceremonial gathering," he said aloud. "Verification complete," the station's AI responded in its maddeningly cheerful tone. "Technician third class is confirmed for attendance. Transport shuttle will depart in 37 minutes. Pushed off from the console, drifting toward the nearest communication terminal. There had to be an error. He was nobody special, just a kid from Sacramento who joined Earth Defense Forces because he couldn't afford to finish college and had always been good with his hands. He fixed things. He didn't fight wars or make grand strategic decisions. But when he tried to contact the duty officer to report the mistake, he was informed that the roster was final and attendance was mandatory. No exceptions. 3 hours later, found himself aboard a military transport heading toward Earth Central Command, surrounded by some of the most decorated warriors in human space. The contrast was almost comical. While veterans traded stories of battles fought and enemies defeated, sat quietly in his basic maintenance uniform, trying to figure out why he'd been included in this gathering of heroes. Colonel Martinez, a woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her ability to inspire troops under impossible circumstances, noticed his discomfort. "First time meeting alien royalty?" she asked, settling into the seat beside him. "First time meeting any royalty," admitted. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm just a maintenance tech." "Maybe," Martinez said thoughtfully. "Or maybe someone higher up the chain knows something we don't. They aren't like us. They don't think the way we do. Their princess might see things in ways that would surprise you." Wanted to ask what she meant, but the transport was already docking with Earth Central Command, the massive space station that served as humanity's military and diplomatic headquarters. As they disembarked, felt increasingly out of place among the assembled warriors and dignitaries. Earth Central Command was a marvel of human engineering, a rotating structure 3 kilometers in diameter that housed everything from advanced research facilities to diplomatic quarters designed to accommodate dozens of different alien species. Had never been aboard the station before, and under other circumstances, he might have been fascinated by the technology and architecture. Instead, he found himself in a ceremonial hall that could have housed a small city, watching as Princess of the Empire made her entrance. Nothing could have prepared him for his first sight of the alien princess. Were humanoid in the broadest sense, but evolution on their high-gravity world had produced beings that seemed designed for war. Stood nearly 7 feet tall, her body encased in what looked like living armor, but was actually her natural crystalline skin. It shifted between deep purple and silver as she moved, each surface catching and refracting light in ways that hurt to look at directly. She had 6 eyes arranged in pairs along her elongated skull, each capable of independent movement and able to process different spectra of light simultaneously. Her movements were precise and economical, suggesting strength that could probably bend steel with minimal effort. But it was her presence that truly overwhelmed the room. Had read about pheromone projection, their ability to communicate emotional states and intentions through biochemical signals, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. The princess radiated power and ancient wisdom, but also something else, a deep sadness that seemed to permeate the very air around her. "Humans of Earth," she spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies human ears could barely detect. "I come before you in accordance with the accords of seeking one among your kind to stand as champion in the trials that will determine our people's future." Admiral Torres stepped forward, her dress uniform immaculate despite the obvious strain of the day's events. "Your Highness, we present our finest warriors for your consideration. Each has proven themselves in battle against your empire's forces. Each represents the best of human courage and capability." Princess Six Eyes swept across the assembled warriors and felt a chill as her gaze briefly touched him before moving on. There was something unsettling about being observed by a being whose visual processing capabilities could analyze everything from quantum field fluctuations to psychological stress markers. She moved through the gathering like a predator evaluating potential prey, stopping occasionally to study particular individuals. When she paused before Colonel Martinez, was certain the selection had been made. Martinez was everything a warrior should be: experienced, decorated, tactically brilliant, and utterly fearless. But after a long moment, the princess moved on. She spent considerable time examining Commander Pike, whose strategic innovations had saved countless human lives during the border wars. She studied Major, whose personal combat record was legendary even among. She even considered Admiral Torres herself, whose leadership had held humanity together during its darkest hours. Each time, after careful analysis, she moved on. Began to relax, assuming he'd be overlooked entirely. He was standing near the back of the hall, partially hidden behind a group of Marine sergeants, when Princess' movement pattern brought her in his direction. He tried to step further back, but the wall prevented any retreat. The princess approached slowly, her 6 eyes now focused entirely on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Up close, he could see details that the briefings hadn't covered: the way her crystalline skin shifted not just with light, but with some internal energy, the subtle patterns that seemed to flow beneath its surface like circuit diagrams made of living crystal. "What is your name, young warrior?" she asked, her voice dropping to a register that seemed to vibrate through his bones. "Your Highness," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not a warrior, I'm a maintenance technician. There's been some mistake." The princess tilted her head, a gesture that was somehow both alien and familiar. "A maintenance technician," she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "You repair what others break." "Yes, ma'am, Your Highness. I fix atmospheric processors, life support systems, things like that. Things that keep people alive." "I suppose, yes." For what felt like an eternity, Princess studied him with all 6 eyes. Was acutely aware that every person in the room was watching this exchange, probably wondering why the alien princess was wasting time on someone so obviously out of place. Then she did something that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. She knelt. The motion brought her down to eye level, and for the first time, he could look directly into her primary pair of eyes without craning his neck. They were deeper than he'd expected, with colors that seemed to shift between violet and silver and something else he couldn't name. She said formally, her voice now carrying new harmonics that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "I name you champion of humanity. You will undertake the 7 trials of worthiness on behalf of your species." The room erupted in confusion. Voices rose in protest and disbelief. Admiral Torres stepped forward, her diplomatic training barely containing her shock. "Your Highness, surely you meant to select one of our experienced warriors. This young man, while no doubt capable in his own field, has no combat training, no command experience." "I have made my choice," Princess cut her off, rising to her full height. "The Accords of grant me sole authority in this selection. The human will be my people's guest aboard the starship. The trials will commence when we reach the neutral moon of Prime." Felt the blood drain from his face. "Your Highness, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I really am just a maintenance tech. I've never even held a weapon, let alone—" "You have held many weapons," the princess interrupted, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed almost amused. "Every tool you use to preserve life is a weapon against entropy, against the forces that would destroy what others have built. You wage war against chaos itself, every time you repair what is broken." She turned to address the room, her presence somehow filling the vast space despite her singular form. "The trials are not merely tests of physical combat. They are examinations of character, of the essential nature that defines a species. I have observed your greatest warriors, your most brilliant strategists, your most accomplished leaders. They are all formidable in their own ways." Her gaze returned to, and he felt pinned in place by the weight of her attention. "But this one carries something different, something that your species may not even recognize in yourselves." "What?" Admiral Torres asked, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Princess was quiet for a long moment, her crystalline skin cycling through colors that seemed to reflect some internal debate. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "Hope," she said simply. "He carries hope without arrogance, determination without cruelty. He sees problems not as enemies to be destroyed, but as puzzles to be solved. In 3,000 years of conquest, my people have never encountered a species that could transform potential defeat into inevitable victory through nothing more than refusing to accept that some things cannot be fixed. She moved toward the exit, her entourage of guards forming around her like a living wall of crystalline armor. "Will accompany me. The trials begin in 7 standard days. The fate of both our civilizations rests on what he discovers about himself in the time between now and then." As the princess and her retinue left the hall, found himself surrounded by some of the most powerful people in human space, all staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. "Well," Colonel Martinez said finally, breaking the stunned silence, "I guess we'd better get you ready for the most important test in human history." Looked around at the faces surrounding him, warriors who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, leaders who had guided humanity through its darkest hours, strategists whose decisions had saved entire worlds. They were all looking to him now, this unremarkable young man who'd been chosen by an alien princess for reasons no one fully understood. For the first time since this surreal day had begun, felt a spark of the very quality princess claimed to have seen in him. He didn't understand why he'd been chosen, and he certainly didn't feel qualified to represent his entire species in trials that could determine the future of human civilization. But he'd spent his entire adult life fixing things that seemed beyond repair, finding solutions to problems that others had given up on. Maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what humanity needed right now. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Tell me everything I need to know. We have 7 days to figure out how to save our species." Admiral Torres smiled for the first time since the princess had made her announcement. "That's the spirit. Let's get to work." As the assembled leaders began making plans and preparations, couldn't shake the feeling that his life as he'd known it was over. Whatever lay ahead in the trials on Prime, whatever tests the Empire had devised to judge the worthiness of humanity, he would face them not as a warrior or a leader or a strategist. He would face them as maintenance technician, problem solver, and perhaps, if Princess was right, humanity's best hope for a peaceful future among the stars. The galaxy was about to discover what humans were truly capable of when their backs were against the wall and everything they cared about hung in the balance. And at the center of that discovery would be one young man who'd never wanted to be anything more than someone who fixed broken things. But then again, maybe that was exactly what the universe needed right now. Someone who believed that even the most damaged, most hopeless situations could be repaired if you just understood how all the pieces fit together. The real question was whether would understand how he fit into this impossible puzzle before it was too late for everyone he'd ever cared about. The next morning brought his first glimpse of technology as he stepped aboard the starship. Nothing in his engineering training had prepared him for this moment. The ship wasn't built, it was grown. Corridors curved like arteries through what felt more like a living organism than a mechanical construct. The walls pulsed with a gentle bioluminescence that responded to his presence, brightening as he approached and dimming in his wake. Princess waited for him in what he assumed was an observation deck, though calling it a room seemed inadequate. The chamber existed within a transparent dome that provided an unobstructed view of space in all directions. Earth hung below them like a blue and white marble, beautiful and fragile in the infinite darkness. "Your world is smaller than I expected," the princess observed without turning from the viewpoint. "Yet your species has proven remarkably persistent in defending it." Joined her at the viewing area, trying not to think about the fact that only a thin barrier of alien technology separated him from the vacuum of space. "We've had a lot of practice defending things we can't afford to lose." This seemed to amuse her. The crystalline patterns in her skin shifted to warmer hues and was beginning to understand that these changes reflected her emotional state. An interesting perspective. Most species we encounter speak of conquest, of taking what they desire. You speak of preservation. "Maybe that's because we've never had enough of anything to think about taking from others," replied, then immediately worried he'd said something diplomatically inappropriate. But Princess turned to study him with what he was learning to recognize as approval. "You may understand more than you realize." Over the next several hours, as the departed Earth's solar system began to comprehend the true scope of what lay ahead, the princess introduced him to culture, history, and the significance of the 7 trials. What he learned both fascinated and terrified him. The Empire wasn't merely a military force. It was a civilization built on the concept of worthiness. For 3, they had expanded across the galaxy not through random conquest, but by testing other species against their own rigid standards. Those found worthy were absorbed into the Empire as valued allies. Those found lacking were either subjugated or eliminated entirely. The trials are ancient, Princess explained as they moved through corridors that seemed to reshape themselves around their passage. Created by my ancestors to ensure that only those species capable of contributing meaningfully to galactic civilization would be permitted to flourish. Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental controls. And what happens to species that fail? The princess was quiet for a long moment, her skin cycling through darker shades. That has not yet been determined for humanity. Your species presents unique challenges to our traditional evaluation methods. She led him to a chamber she called the Archives, where history was stored in crystalline matrices that projected three-dimensional recordings when activated. Watched in awe as the rise of the Empire played out before him, worlds transformed, species elevated or eliminated, the slow but inevitable spread of influence across vast sections of the galaxy. In 3,000 years, Princess said, only 17 species have been judged fully worthy of equal partnership with the Empire. Hundreds have been found adequate for supervised membership. The remainder. She didn't need to finish. The recordings showed worlds reduced to radioactive slag, once thriving civilizations erased from existence with surgical precision. The Empire didn't simply conquer, it curated the galaxy according to its own definition of worthiness. Why, asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why does it matter so much what other species are like? Why not just leave them alone? The question seemed to strike something deep within the princess. Her 6 eyes focused on him with renewed intensity, and for a moment, her carefully maintained diplomatic composure cracked. Because we failed, she said simply. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications didn't fully understand. Princess moved to another crystal matrix, activating a recording that showed not conquest, but something far more tragic. The hologram depicted a world of breathtaking beauty, crystalline cities that rose like living sculptures from landscapes that seemed painted by artists rather than shaped by nature. But as watched, the scene began to change. The crystal spires darkened, the artistic landscapes cracked and withered. In the space of minutes, he witnessed the death of an entire world. Our prime, the princess said quietly. We were once much like your species, curious, creative, constantly building and experimenting and reaching for new possibilities. But we grew too fast, consumed too much, pushed too hard against the limits of what our world could sustain. The recording showed the final moments of civilization on their birth world. Massive evacuation ships lifted off from dying cities, while the planet itself began to crack apart, its core destabilized by reckless resource extraction. We saved ourselves, Princess continued, but we learned that intelligence without wisdom leads only to destruction. Since then, we have sought to ensure that other species do not repeat our mistakes. Better to test them, to guide them, than to allow them to follow the path that nearly destroyed us. Stared at the recording, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that rested on the princess's shoulders. You're not just an empire, you're trying to be teachers. We are trying to be worthy of the second chance the universe gave us, she corrected. But your species, you present challenges we have never encountered before. She activated another crystal matrix and found himself watching recordings of human military engagements during the border wars. But these weren't the heroic victories he'd heard about in the military briefings. These were desperate, improvised actions where human forces outnumbered and had somehow managed to achieve impossible objectives through sheer stubbornness and creative problem-solving. The Battle of Station, Princess narrated as they watched a small group of human defenders hold off an assault force 10 times their size. Your people were surrounded, cut off from reinforcement, facing weapons that should have reduced their position to atoms within minutes. On the recording, watched human engineers rapidly converting life support systems into improvised weapons, using maintenance drones as guided missiles, turning the station's own structure into a maze of death traps that negated the advantages in firepower and numbers. They should have surrendered, the princess said, but her tone carried admiration rather than criticism. Any rational analysis would have concluded that resistance was futile. But they didn't surrender, observed. No, they did something that broke our understanding of tactical mathematics. They won. More recordings played. The defense of Colony 7, where human farmers used agricultural equipment to destroy war machines. The Battle of the Asteroid Belt, where human miners turned their entire asteroid field into a weapon. The legendary Last Stand at Station, where a single human ship had somehow disabled an entire battle group using nothing but creative applications of basic physics. Every species we have encountered follows predictable patterns when faced with superior force, Princess explained. They surrender, they flee, or they fight until destroyed. Your species does none of these things. You adapt, you improvise, you find solutions that should not exist. Began to see what had drawn the princess's attention to him specifically. Every victory in the recordings had been achieved not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through individuals who had looked at impossible problems and refused to accept that they couldn't be solved. The maintenance technician mentality, he murmured, understanding dawning. I do not know this term. When something breaks, you don't replace it or give up on it. You figure out why it's broken and you fix it. Even if you don't have the right tools, even if you've never seen that particular problem before, even if everyone else says it can't be done, you just find a way. Princess' skin brightened to shades that was learning meant excitement or approval. This is why the traditional trials may be inadequate for judging your species. We test for courage, strength, wisdom, strategic thinking, all qualities your people possess in abundance. But you possess something else, something that has no name in our language. What? The ability to see failure not as an endpoint, but as a starting point for finding new solutions. As they talked, began to understand the true purpose of his presence aboard he wasn't just a champion who would face the trials. He was a representative of something the Empire had never encountered before. His performance wouldn't just determine humanity's fate. It would challenge the very foundations of how the Empire evaluated other civilizations. The princess showed him recordings of other species that had faced the 7 trials. Some had demonstrated remarkable physical prowess. Others had displayed strategic brilliance or cultural sophistication. But in every case, there had been clear parameters for success and failure, established criteria that the evaluators could apply with mathematical precision. Your species defies such evaluation, Princess admitted. How do you judge the worthiness of beings who consistently achieve the impossible through methods that should not work? That evening, as tried to rest in quarters that had been specially prepared for human physiology, he found himself staring through a transparent wall at the star field beyond. Somewhere among those lights was Prime, the neutral moon where the trials would take place. In 5 more days, he would face tests designed by a civilization that had been perfecting the art of evaluating other species for thousands of years. A soft chime indicated that someone was requesting entry to his quarters. The door, if it could be called a door, dissolved into mist, revealing Princess. She entered without waiting for permission, moving with the fluid grace that seemed natural to her species. You are troubled, she observed, settling into a chair that formed itself from the floor to accommodate her unique physiology. Shouldn't I be? Replied. Tomorrow you're going to start teaching me about trials that could determine whether my entire species lives or dies, and I'm just a maintenance tech who's never done anything important in his life. You maintain life support systems. I fix air recyclers and water purifiers. It's not exactly heroic. Princess was quiet for a moment, her skin cycling through contemplative purples and silvers. Tell me, what would happen to your space station if you were not there to maintain these systems? Shrugged, eventually they'd break down, people would start dying. How many people? On Gamma 7, about 1,500. And if those systems failed throughout human space? The question made uncomfortable. He'd never really thought about the broader implications of his work. I guess millions of people would die, maybe billions. So your daily labor preserves billions of lives. I maintain machines. Other people do the important work. Without those machines, could the important work continue? Began to see where she was leading him, but the implications felt too large to accept. You're saying that fixing air recyclers makes me some kind of hero. I am saying that heroism may not be what your species thinks it is, Princess replied. Your greatest warriors win individual battles. Your greatest leaders make decisions that preserve your civilization for years or decades. But people like you, people who maintain the foundation upon which everything else rests. You preserve your civilization every single day. She stood and moved to the transparent wall, gazing out at the stars. The trials were designed to identify great leaders, mighty warriors, brilliant strategists. We have never tested for the quality that may be most important of all, the willingness to do necessary work without recognition or reward. "What if I fail?" asked quietly. "What if I'm not whatever you think I am?" Princess turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd met her, her expression seemed almost human. "Then I will have misjudged your species, and both our civilizations will pay the price for my error." The weight of responsibility settled over like a physical force. Billions of human lives, the future of an entire species, resting on the performance of someone who'd never wanted anything more than to fix broken things and make sure people had clean air to breathe. "No pressure," he muttered. This time, he was certain the princess's skin shift indicated amusement. "Perhaps pressure is exactly what your species needs to reveal its true nature. After all, carbon requires tremendous pressure to become diamond." After she left, lay in his bioadaptive bed, staring at the ceiling that displayed a slowly shifting pattern of stars. In 5 days, he would begin trials that would test not just his individual capabilities, but the fundamental character of humanity itself. He thought about his parents back on Earth, probably wondering why he hadn't called for his weekly check-in. He thought about his friends on the maintenance crew, dealing with broken atmospheric processors, and wondering where he'd disappeared to. He thought about the 1,500 people on orbital station Gamma 7, counting on systems he'd personally maintained to keep them alive. For the first time since this impossible journey had begun, felt something other than fear or confusion. He felt the same quiet determination that had driven him to crawl through Jeffrey's tubes at 3 in the morning to repair a failing water recycler. The same patient focus that had guided him through thousands of routine maintenance tasks that no one else would ever notice or appreciate. Princess was right about one thing. He might not be a warrior or a leader or a strategic genius, but he was someone who understood that the most important work was often the least visible work, that keeping things running was just as valuable as building them in the first place. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe, when faced with trials designed to test the worthiness of an entire species, the most important quality wasn't the ability to fight or command or strategize. Maybe it was the ability to look at something broken and believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that it could be fixed. Closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that in just a few days he would discover whether the faith that Princess had placed in him, and the faith that humanity was unknowingly placing in him, was justified. The stars continued their ancient dance outside his window, indifferent to the drama playing out within the small ship carrying 2 beings whose choices would determine the fate of civilizations. But somewhere among those distant lights, the neutral moon of Prime waited with its ancient trial grounds, ready to test whether humanity deserved a place among the stars. Maintenance technician and reluctant champion of his species, would soon find out if fixing broken things had taught him enough about the universe to help fix a relationship between 2 civilizations that seemed destined for war. The countdown to the trials had begun, and with each passing hour, the weight of destiny grew heavier. But was used to carrying heavy loads. It was just another part of the job, and he'd never failed to complete a job once he'd started it. That record was about to face its ultimate test. The next 3 days aboard the transformed in ways he'd never imagined possible. Princess proved to be more than just his captor or guide. She became something resembling a teacher, though her methods of instruction everything thought he knew about learning. Rather than drilling him on combat techniques or strategic theory, the princess focused on what she called perspective alignment. She showed him how society functioned, not just its power structures and military capabilities, but its fundamental philosophy about existence itself. "Your species thinks in terms of problems and solutions," she observed during one of their sessions in the ship's central library. Around them, crystalline matrices held the accumulated knowledge of thousands of conquered worlds. "We think in terms of patterns and deviations." Struggled to understand the distinction. Isn't that the same thing? "Observe." Princess activated a display showing the mathematical principles that govern space travel. Instead of the linear equations expected, he saw complex patterns that seemed to flow and shift like living things. Your engineers would see this as a propulsion problem to be solved with thrust calculations and fuel efficiency. We see it as a harmony to be achieved between ship and space itself. The difference was subtle but profound. Human technology fought against natural laws, using brute force to achieve desired outcomes. Technology worked with those laws, finding elegant solutions that required minimal energy expenditure. It's like the difference between breaking down a door and finding the right key, said slowly. An apt comparison, but which approach do you think is more effective when facing the unknown? Considered this. His maintenance work had taught him that sometimes you needed to force a stuck valve open, but more often the best solution was understanding why it was stuck in the first place. Depends on whether you have time to find the key. And if you do not, then you break down the door and deal with the consequences later. Princess' skin shifted to colors, was learning to associate with surprise. Most species would say they would find another door or give up entirely. Your answer suggests that your people see consequences as manageable rather than final. That afternoon, the princess introduced to El, the warrior who would serve as his primary instructor for the physical aspects of the trials. Had thought Princess was intimidating, but El was terrifying in an entirely different way. Where the princess was elegant and graceful, El was pure martial efficiency. His crystalline skin had been modified for combat, with sharper edges and denser formations that could probably stop projectile weapons. He moved like a predator, every gesture calculated for maximum effectiveness. "This is your champion?" El's voice carried harmonics that suggested skepticism bordering on insult. "He appears fragile even by human standards." "Appearances can be deceiving," Princess replied mildly. "Test his capabilities." What followed was perhaps the most humiliating hour of his life. El put him through a series of physical challenges that revealed just how unprepared he was for any kind of combat situation. Couldn't match the speed, strength, or agility. He couldn't even properly hold the energy weapons that would be available during the trials. But something interesting happened during the assessment. When faced with a combat scenario he couldn't win through conventional means, began applying the same problem-solving approach he used in his maintenance work. If he couldn't overpower El, maybe he could outthink him. If he couldn't move fast enough to avoid attacks, maybe he could predict where they were coming from. "Interesting," El observed after had successfully avoided capture for several minutes by using the training chamber's own systems against the warrior. "He does not fight as we understand fighting." "Explain," Princess requested. "Warriors seek to destroy their opponents. This one seeks to understand them. He studies my patterns, learns from my techniques, then uses that knowledge to avoid confrontation rather than escalate it." Wiped sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily. "I can't beat you in a fair fight, so I don't fight fair. I change the parameters until the fight becomes something I might actually win." "That is not honorable combat," El stated flatly. "No, but it's effective problem-solving," replied. "Honor doesn't keep life support systems running." This exchange seemed to fascinate Princess. She spent the next hour questioning about his approach to various maintenance challenges, particularly situations where he'd had to devise unconventional solutions to critical problems. "Tell me about the most difficult repair you have ever completed," she requested. Thought back through years of maintenance work. Probably the Reactor 7 incident on Gamma Station. Coolant system failure during a solar storm, couldn't shut down the reactor safely, couldn't get replacement parts, couldn't even access the damaged components directly because of radiation levels. "How did you resolve this?" "I didn't at first. Spent 3 days trying conventional approaches while the reactor temperature kept climbing. Finally realized I was thinking about it wrong. Instead of trying to fix the cooling system, I needed to create a new one using components that were never designed for that purpose." Princess leaned forward, her 6 eyes focused intently on. "Continue." "I rerouted the station's waste reclamation system to carry coolant, used atmospheric processors as heat exchangers, and turned the entire outer ring of the station into a giant radiator. It wasn't elegant. It violated about 50 safety protocols, and it took 48 hours of non-stop work to implement. But it was effective. Reactor temperature dropped to safe levels within 6 hours. The system ran for 3 weeks until we could get proper replacement parts." El had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. You used the entire station as a component in your repair. I used whatever was available. The station's safety was more important than following standard procedures. This is exactly what I meant, Princess said to her warrior companion. He does not see boundaries between systems. He sees possibilities for connection and adaptation. That evening was given access to the ship's intelligence archives, detailed records of every species that had the 7 trials. What he discovered both enlightened and terrified him. The trials weren't just tests of individual capability. They were comprehensive evaluations designed to reveal the fundamental characteristics that defined entire civilizations. Physical prowess, strategic thinking, moral reasoning, adaptability under pressure, leadership potential, technological innovation, and cultural sophistication. Each trial targeted a different aspect of species-wide behavior. Studied the records of species that had been judged worthy of full partnership with the Empire. They were impressive civilizations, the crystalline with their perfect harmony between technology and nature, the gas giant dwellers of who had mastered energy manipulation on a planetary scale, the hive mind collective that could coordinate the actions of billions of individuals as if they were a single organism. But he also studied the records of species that had failed. The warrior kings who had demonstrated incredible combat prowess but no capacity for cooperation. The technopriests of Minerva, whose technological achievements were offset by their complete inability to adapt when facing unexpected challenges. The philosopher mystics of 442b, whose wisdom was profound but whose practical applications were virtually non-existent. A pattern began to emerge. The trials didn't just test for positive qualities, they revealed fatal flaws. Species that excelled in some areas but completely failed in others were typically judged unworthy of equal partnership. The tests are designed to find reasons to reject us, told Princess the next morning. Not reject, categorize, she corrected. Every species has its proper place in the galactic order. The trials determine whether that place is as an equal, a subordinate, or an obstacle to be removed. And what happens if we don't fit into any of those categories? Princess was quiet for a long moment. That scenario has not occurred in 3,000 years of testing. Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. But you think it might occur with humanity. I think your species presents challenges that our testing protocols were not designed to address. The trials assume that strength, intelligence, and adaptation follow predictable patterns. Your people consistently demonstrate these qualities in ways that defy prediction. She showed him more recordings from the border wars, focusing on incidents that had baffled military analysts. Human forces that had won battles they should have lost, used tactics that violated established strategic principles, achieved objectives through methods that seemed to ignore basic physics. In every case, Princess noted, your people succeeded by changing the fundamental parameters of the engagement. When faced with superior firepower, they redefined what victory meant. When confronted with impossible odds, they altered the conditions until the odds became manageable. We improvise. You do more than improvise. You restructure reality to match your needs rather than accepting reality as fixed. Began to understand why his selection had caused such confusion among humanity's leadership. The trials weren't looking for the best human warrior or strategist or leader. They were looking for the most essentially human, someone who embodied the characteristics that made humanity unique among galactic civilizations. The maintenance technician mentality, he murmured, using the phrase he'd coined earlier. Explain this concept more fully. Thought carefully about how to express something he'd never really articulated before. When you're responsible for keeping complex systems running, you learn that everything is connected to everything else. A failure in one area affects other areas, sometimes in ways you don't expect. You can't just focus on individual problems. You have to understand the whole system and how changes in one part ripple through everything else. And when the system is too complex to understand fully, you make your best guess, try something, and adapt based on what happens. The goal isn't to be perfect, it's to keep things running long enough to find better solutions. Princess' skin brightened to colors that had learned indicated excitement or approval. This is why the traditional trials may be inadequate for evaluating your species. We test for mastery of individual capabilities. You demonstrate mastery of integration and adaptation. On their final day before reaching Prime, Princess took to a part of the ship he hadn't seen before, what she called the meditation chamber. Unlike the rest of the vessel, this space seemed designed for contemplation rather than function. Soft lights shifted in patterns that seemed to encourage introspection, and the very air carried subtle harmonics that promoted calm focus. "Tomorrow you begin the trials," she said as they settled into positions that accommodated their different physiologies. "There are things you must understand before we reach the testing grounds. Such as, the trials are not merely a test of your capabilities. They are a test of whether your species deserves to continue existing as a free civilization." The blunt statement hit like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Princess's expression grew somber, her skin cycling through darker hues. "My people have been the guardians of galactic civilization for 3. We have seen what happens when species are allowed to develop without guidance. Chaos, destruction, the collapse of everything we have worked to build." She activated a display that showed the current state of the galaxy. Vast regions under control, smaller areas governed by allied species, and scattered zones marked in red that indicated active threats to galactic stability. "The universe is not large enough to accommodate unlimited diversity," she continued. "Species that cannot contribute to galactic harmony become sources of chaos. Sometimes that chaos can be contained through subordinate membership in the Empire. Sometimes it cannot." Stared at the display, noting how small the zones of human influence appeared compared to the vast purple expanses of space. "And if humanity can't be contained, then the threat must be eliminated before it can spread to other systems." The casual way she stated this possibility made blood run cold. Princess wasn't talking about conquest or subjugation. She was talking about genocide on a species-wide scale. "How many civilizations have you eliminated?" "Fewer than you might fear, more than we would prefer," she replied honestly. "Each decision is made only after extensive evaluation and considerable debate among our highest councils. But the responsibility for galactic stability ultimately rests with those who have the power to maintain it." Felt the weight of billions of lives settling on his shoulders. The trials weren't just about proving humanity's worthiness for partnership with the Empire. They were about proving that humanity deserved to exist at all. "No pressure," he whispered, echoing his own words from several days earlier. "Indeed, but consider this. Your species has already achieved something that fewer than 20 others have managed in our recorded history. You have fought us to a standstill. That suggests capabilities that extend far beyond simple military prowess. Or simple stubbornness. Perhaps they are the same thing, viewed from different perspectives." As they prepared for sleep, their last night before reaching the trial grounds, found himself thinking about everyone he'd left behind on Earth and the orbital stations. His parents, his friends on the maintenance crew, the 1,500 people on Gamma 7 who probably didn't even know their lives hung in the balance. Tomorrow, he would begin tests designed by one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy to evaluate whether humanity deserved a place among the stars. He was just one person, carrying the hopes and dreams and futures of billions, and he'd never felt less prepared for anything in his life. But he was also someone who'd spent years keeping complex systems running when everything seemed to be falling apart. He was someone who'd learned that the most important work was often the least visible work, that persistence mattered more than perfection, and that there was always another solution if you were willing to look hard enough. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The stars outside his window seemed brighter as they approached its destination, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen when human stubbornness met expectations on the ancient testing grounds of Prime. Maintenance technician and reluctant champion was about to discover whether fixing broken things had taught him enough about the universe to help fix the most important problem of all, ensuring that humanity survived to see tomorrow's dawn. Prime looked like someone had taken a perfectly normal moon and redesigned it as a testing ground for gods. As they descended through the thin atmosphere, pressed his face against the transparent wall of his quarters, watching in awe as the surface revealed itself in impossible detail. Ancient structures rose from crystalline plains like monuments to civilizations that had transcended physical limitations. Geometric patterns carved into the moon's surface stretched for hundreds of kilometers, visible from orbit but incomprehensible in their complexity. Energy fields shimmered between massive pylons that pierced the sky like crystalline needles, creating barriers and pathways that conventional physics. 3,000 years of trial participants have left their mark, Princess observed, joining him at the viewing wall. Each species that underwent testing was permitted to contribute one permanent addition to the trial grounds. What you see is the accumulated architectural legacy of civilizations from across the galaxy. Identified structures that seemed familiar, geometric forms that resembled human aesthetic preferences, though built on a scale that dwarfed anything Earth had ever constructed. But most of the constructions were utterly alien, following design principles that hurt to contemplate directly. The testing arena itself is neutral territory, the princess continued. No weapons except those provided for the trials, no outside assistance, no interference from any galactic authority. For the duration of your testing, this moon exists outside the normal political structure of the Empire. The touched down at a spaceport that seemed to have grown rather than been built, its organic curves blending seamlessly with the natural rock formations. As they disembarked, felt the moon's lighter gravity, about 60% of Earth normal, and found himself taking longer steps to compensate. Waiting for them at the port were three figures that made reconsider everything he thought he understood about the scope of galactic civilization. They had been intimidating, but these beings represented something beyond his previous experience. The first was clearly but one whose crystalline skin had been modified far beyond anything had seen. Geometric patterns flowed across their surface in configurations that seemed to shift between 2 and 3 dimensions. When they moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around them. The second figure, easy categorization. They appeared to be made of living metal, their humanoid form constantly shifting between solid and liquid states. Energy patterns flowed through them like blood through veins, and could feel electromagnetic fields fluctuating in response to their presence. The third was perhaps the most disturbing, a being that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. Could see through them to the structures behind, but the space they occupied was clearly not empty. Looking directly at them made his eyes water and his brain itch. "The trial administrators," Princess said formally. "Representatives of the 3 most ancient civilizations in the Empire. They will oversee your testing and ensure impartiality." The crystalline spoke first, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass ears and resonate directly in his bones. "Champion of humanity, you stand upon ground hallowed by 3 of testing. Species that have passed through these trials now rule sectors of the galaxy. Those that have failed exist only in our archives." The liquid metal being's communication was different, patterns of electromagnetic radiation that's neural interface translated into comprehensible language. "You will face 7 trials over 7 days. Each trial will test a different aspect of your species' fundamental nature. Success requires not perfection, but demonstration of worthiness for continued independent existence." The partially phased entity's words seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if spoken by someone standing in several different locations simultaneously. "Know this, young human, the trials are not merely tests of individual capability. They are windows through which we observe the essential characteristics of entire civilizations. Your performance will determine the fate of billions." Felt his throat go dry, but he managed to respond. "I understand. What do I need to know about the trials themselves?" The administrators exchanged communications in frequencies and dimensions couldn't perceive directly. Finally, the crystalline replied. "Traditional protocol requires that trial participants enter the testing grounds without specific knowledge of what they will face. However, your species presents unique evaluation challenges. We have decided to provide basic parameters." What followed was perhaps the most terrifying briefing it ever received. The 7 trials of worthiness were designed to test every aspect of what made a species viable for galactic citizenship. Physical prowess, strategic thinking, moral reasoning, technological innovation, cultural sophistication, adaptive capability, and leadership potential. But the trials weren't standardized tests with predictable parameters. Each was specifically configured based on the species being evaluated, designed to reveal both strengths and fatal weaknesses. The administrators had been studying humanity through the border wars, analyzing every recorded engagement, every tactical decision, every innovation human forces had demonstrated. The trials will test your species' greatest strengths, the liquid metal administrator explained. But they will also probe for the flaws that might make humanity a threat to galactic stability. What kind of flaws? Asked, though he dreaded the answer. Your people demonstrate remarkable individual initiative, the phased entity replied. But this same quality could lead to chaos if it cannot be properly channeled. Your species shows extraordinary adaptability, but adaptation without ethical constraints could result in fundamental instability. The crystalline administrator added, most concerning is your species' apparent inability to accept limitations. This quality has enabled many of your greatest achievements, but it could also drive you to actions that threaten the carefully maintained balance of galactic civilization. Began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. The trials weren't just about proving humanity's capabilities. They were about proving that those capabilities wouldn't eventually destroy everything the Empire had spent rebuilding. That afternoon, he was given a tour of the trial facilities. Each testing area had been constructed to accommodate the specific challenges he would face, though the administrators revealed nothing about what those challenges would entail. The physical prowess arena was a vast space that seemed to shift between different environmental conditions. High gravity, low gravity, various atmospheric compositions, terrain that ranged from urban environments to alien wilderness. Realized that his trial wouldn't be about demonstrating superior physical capabilities, but about proving that humanity could function effectively in conditions far outside their natural parameters. The strategic thinking facility resembled a massive war room, with holographic displays capable of simulating scenarios on scales ranging from individual combat to galactic conflicts. Here would face strategic challenges that had broken other species' minds. The moral reasoning chamber was surprisingly simple, just a circular room with white walls and a single chair, but could feel something in the air, a sense of weight and consequence that suggested the decisions made in this space carried profound implications. The remaining facilities were equally imposing in their understated complexity. Each had been designed not just to test specific capabilities, but to reveal the fundamental decision-making processes that defined entire civilizations. That evening, Princess joined for what she called a clarification session. She seemed more subdued than usual, her skin cycling through colors that suggested anxiety or uncertainty. There are things about the trials that the administrators did not explain, she began without preamble. Things you must understand if you are to have any chance of success. Felt his stomach clench. What kind of things? The trials are not pass-or-fail evaluations. They are comprehensive psychological profiles designed to predict how your species will behave as it becomes more powerful. The administrators are not looking for perfection, they are looking for stability. She activated a display showing statistical analyses from previous trials. Saw complex charts tracking everything from stress responses to ethical decision patterns, all correlated with long-term outcomes. Species that demonstrate too much ambition are often judged unstable, Princess explained. But species that demonstrate too little are considered unlikely to contribute meaningfully to galactic advancement. The acceptable parameters are narrower than you might expect. So I need to be ambitious but not too ambitious, strong but not too strong, innovative but not too innovative. You need to be human, she replied. But you also need to convince the administrators that humanity's essential nature is compatible with the existing galactic order. Studied the charts, noting the narrow bands of acceptable performance in each category. A horrible realization began to dawn on him. The species that failed, they didn't fail because they weren't good enough. They failed because they were too different. In many cases, yes, the galaxy has room for diversity within acceptable parameters, but fundamental incompatibility with established systems cannot be tolerated. Felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. So the trials aren't really about worthiness, they're about conformity. Princess' skin shifted to colors he hadn't seen before, deep crimsons shot through with silver streaks. Do you think that assessment is unfair? I think it explains why humanity has been such a problem for your empire, replied. We're not good at conforming to systems we didn't help design. And yet conformity may be the only path to survival for your species. Maybe survival isn't worth it if it means becoming something we're not. The words escaped his mouth before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted speaking so bluntly. But Princess' reaction surprised him. Instead of offense or anger, her skin brightened to shades that indicated something like approval. "That response is exactly why I selected you," she said quietly. "Most species, when faced with the choice between survival and identity, choose survival. Your people consistently choose identity, even when it appears suicidal." She moved to the chamber's viewing area, gazing out at the trial grounds where the next morning would begin testing. "I have spent the past several days trying to understand what drove me to select a maintenance technician over decorated warriors and brilliant strategists. I believe I finally understand." "What?" "Warriors fight to win. Strategists plan to achieve objectives. Leaders make decisions to benefit their followers. But maintenance technicians work to keep things functioning, regardless of recognition or reward. They understand that the most important victories are often invisible ones." Joined her at the viewing area, watching as energy patterns shifted between the distant pylons. "You think that's what humanity needs in the trials? Someone who focuses on keeping things running rather than achieving great victories." "I think the trials themselves may be broken," Princess said quietly. "They were designed to evaluate species that follow predictable patterns of development. Your people defy prediction at every turn." "So what happens if the trials can't accurately evaluate humanity?" "Then the administrators will likely conclude that your species represents an unacceptable variable in their carefully ordered galaxy." Her skin darkened to shades that suggested grave concern. "And unacceptable variables are typically eliminated." Felt the weight of responsibility settling over him like a physical force. Tomorrow he would begin trials designed by beings whose civilization had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. Those trials might be fundamentally incapable of accurately judging humanity's worthiness, but their results would still determine whether his species lived or died. "No pressure," he whispered again, the phrase becoming his personal mantra in the face of impossible responsibility. But as he stood there looking out at the alien structures that rose from Prime's surface like monuments to cosmic ambition, felt something else stirring within him. It was the same quiet determination that had driven him through years of thankless maintenance work, the same stubborn refusal to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. The trials might be broken. The evaluation criteria might be biased toward conformity rather than genuine worthiness. The entire system might be designed to eliminate species like humanity simply because they were too different to fit into established patterns. But was a maintenance technician. When faced with broken systems, he didn't accept their limitations. He found ways to fix them or work around them. Tomorrow, he would enter the trial grounds carrying not just the hopes of humanity, but perhaps the possibility of changing how the galaxy itself thought about the value of diversity and the meaning of worthiness. The administrators expected him to prove that humanity could conform to their standards. Princess hoped he could demonstrate that humanity's nonconformity was itself valuable. Maintenance technician and reluctant champion was planning something neither side expected. He was going to approach the trials the same way he approached every broken system he'd ever encountered, by understanding how it was supposed to work, identifying why it wasn't working, and then finding a way to make it work better. The 7 trials of worthiness were about to encounter something they'd never faced before, someone who saw them not as tests to be passed, but as problems to be solved. And had never met a problem he couldn't eventually figure out how to fix. The first trial began at dawn, though dawn on Prime was unlike anything it experienced. The moon's rotation and the complex energy fields generated by the ancient structures created a sunrise that seemed to emerge from multiple directions simultaneously, casting shadows that shifted in impossible patterns across the crystalline landscape. Stood at the entrance to the physical prowess arena, wearing a bioadaptive suit that the administrators had provided. The garment was clearly technology, responding to his movements and environmental conditions with adjustments that felt like having a second skin that actually understood what he was trying to accomplish. The 3 trial administrators observed from a platform that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, their alien forms barely visible against the shifting background of energy fields and geometric impossibilities. Princess stood nearby, her expression unreadable but her skin cycling through patterns that was beginning to recognize as intense concentration mixed with anxiety. Champion of humanity, the crystalline administrator announced. You will now demonstrate your species' physical capabilities under conditions designed to test adaptability, endurance, and problem-solving under stress. The arena itself began to change as soon as stepped through the entrance barrier. What had appeared to be a simple enclosed space suddenly expanded into something that seemed to stretch for kilometers in every direction. The floor beneath his feet shifted from smooth crystal to rough stone to something that felt organic and slightly warm. Gravity fluctuated without warning, jumping from moon normal to what felt like 3 times Earth gravity, then dropping to almost nothing before stabilizing at a level that made every step feel like a carefully calculated leap. The atmosphere composition changed as well, sometimes oxygen-rich and energizing, sometimes thin and challenging, occasionally carrying trace gases that made his bioadaptive suit's filtration systems work overtime. But the real challenge wasn't the environmental variations. It was the obstacles that began appearing around him. The first was a chasm that opened suddenly in his path, easily 30 meters wide with no apparent bottom. Traditional thinking would suggest finding a way to jump across or climb down and up the other side, but approached it the way he approached any maintenance problem, by understanding the underlying system. The chasm wasn't random. It had appeared in response to his approach, which meant the arena was actively monitoring and responding to his actions. If it was a test of physical capability, the solution probably wasn't about superhuman athletic performance. It was about using available resources creatively. Examine the edges of the chasm and notice that the crystal formations weren't uniform. Some sections showed stress patterns that suggested they could be shaped or manipulated. He found a piece of crystalline debris and tested his theory, striking one of the formations in a specific pattern. The crystal responded by extending outward, forming a bridge across the chasm. Not a particularly elegant bridge, and definitely not one that would support much weight, but wasn't trying to build permanent infrastructure. He was trying to solve an immediate problem with available resources. The administrator's platform followed his progress as he crossed the improvised bridge, and could feel their attention like a physical weight. He suspected they were analyzing not just his solution, but his approach to problem-solving itself. The second obstacle was more complex, a maze of energy barriers that shifted position every few seconds. The barriers themselves were painful to touch, but not lethal, designed to test persistence and pattern recognition rather than raw endurance. Most trial participants probably attempted to memorize the shifting patterns and time their movements accordingly. Tried that approach for about 30 seconds before abandoning it as inefficient. Instead, he studied the energy sources powering the barriers. Every system had inputs and outputs, and energy barriers required considerable power to maintain. If he could understand the power distribution system, he might be able to find a more elegant solution. Sure enough, the barriers were being generated by crystalline nodes embedded in the maze walls. The nodes were connected by conduits that carried energy in predictable patterns. Couldn't shut down the system that would probably violate the trial parameters, but he could work within it. He began moving through the maze not by avoiding the barriers, but by timing his movements to match the energy distribution cycles. When power flowed to barriers on his right, he moved left. When the left side barriers activated, he shifted right. It required constant attention and precise timing, but it was fundamentally similar to maintaining complex life support systems where multiple processes had to be coordinated simultaneously. The third obstacle made laugh despite the circumstances. It was a massive piece of machinery, clearly alien in design but recognizably broken. Crystalline components had cracked, energy conduits had been severed, and what appeared to be some kind of central processing matrix was displaying error patterns in colors that hurt to look at directly. "Fix it to proceed," announced a voice that seemed to come from the machinery itself. This was exactly the kind of problem had been solving his entire adult life. The only difference was the scale and the fact that he'd never seen this particular technology before. But broken was broken, regardless of whether the technology came from Earth or the other side of the galaxy. He started with basic diagnostics, tracing energy flows and identifying critical failure points. The machinery was more complex than anything he'd worked on before, but the fundamental principles were familiar. Power came in from external sources, flowed through distribution networks to various subsystems, and coordinated through a central control matrix to produce desired outputs. The repair work required improvisation on a level that would have impressed his old maintenance crew. Used pieces from non-critical subsystems to replace damaged components in essential areas. He rerouted power flows around severed conduits using backup pathways that had probably been forgotten by the original designers. He even managed to restore partial functionality to the central matrix by bypassing damaged sections entirely. When the machinery finally hummed back to life, displaying status patterns in healthy blues and greens, felt the same satisfaction he'd always experienced when solving a particularly challenging maintenance problem. The fact that this repair might determine the survival of his entire species didn't diminish the simple pleasure of making something broken work again. The arena continued to present challenges throughout the day, environmental hazards that required creative solutions, physical obstacles that demanded endurance and problem-solving in equal measure, and scenarios that tested his ability to function effectively under extreme stress. But as the hours passed, began to realize something important. The trial wasn't really testing his physical capabilities at all. It was testing his approach to problems, his willingness to think outside conventional parameters, and his ability to maintain focus and effectiveness when everything around him was designed to be disorienting and unpredictable. By the time the first trial ended, was exhausted but oddly confident. He might not have demonstrated superhuman physical prowess, but he had shown something else, the essentially human quality of refusing to accept that problems couldn't be solved. That evening, as he recovered in quarters that the administrators had prepared for him, Princess visited with an expression that couldn't quite read. "Your performance in the first trial has generated considerable debate among the administrators," she began without preamble. "Good debate or bad debate? Both your solutions to the physical challenges were unprecedented. In 3,000 years of trials, no participant has attempted to repair broken test equipment rather than find ways around it." Shrugged, it was broken. Fixing it seemed like the obvious solution. That response encapsulates exactly what has the administrators concerned. Your species sees broken as a temporary condition rather than a permanent state. Isn't that a good thing? Princess settled into a chair that formed itself to accommodate her physiology, her skin cycling through thoughtful purples and silvers. It could be, or it could be profoundly destabilizing to galactic civilization. She activated a display showing analyses from the first trial, saw charts tracking his stress responses, decision-making patterns, and problem-solving approaches, all compared to thousands of previous trial participants. Most species, when faced with obstacles, seek to overcome them through strength, speed, or intelligence, she explained. Your approach was different. You sought to understand the obstacles themselves and then modify either them or your relationship to them. That's basic maintenance philosophy, replied. You can't fix something unless you understand how it's supposed to work. But you applied that philosophy to challenges that were never intended to be fixed. The energy maze, for example, was designed to test persistence and pattern recognition. You treated it as a power distribution problem and solved it like a maintenance issue. Began to see why this might concern the administrators. They're worried that humanity won't accept the galaxy the way it is. They think we'll try to fix things that aren't supposed to be changed. Precisely. The current galactic order has been carefully balanced for thousands of years. Species that view fundamental systems as problems to be solved rather than realities to be accepted could destabilize everything. That night lay in his bioadaptive bed thinking about the 6 trials still ahead of him. Physical prowess had been just the beginning, and if his approach to relatively simple challenges had already generated controversy among the administrators, he could only